We are thankful today to be able to come together on this, the first day of the week, to worship our God. We have not come to please ourselves. We have not come to be entertained. We have come to glorify and magnify the God who created us, the God who made us. He, being the object of our worship, has designed for us exactly what we do on this day. And so we are limited as to what we may do and how we may address the Father. But this does not in any way limit our feelings, our spirit, our confidence in God. In fact, I've always felt that it strengthens it. And actually we are put to a time of maybe a test or decision. I don't say that so much when I say we, but the world in general may be, as they are confronted with what men design and what God has designed and which way they will go. And after all, we have to make a decision, whether we like it or not, whether we want to or not. Men shy away from and turn away from the idea of having to decide which way to go. But you know, when you drive down the road and the road forks, you got to go one way or the other. There's not much left there. And our lesson this morning is designed as best we can to try to persuade you to make the proper decision. Life seems to fork, the road of life seems to fork every few steps. Maybe it seems like a little more in our time. As evil increases and it looks as if the devil accelerates his efforts to move people away from God and win them to his side. And we have to make decisions. There are many things, many passages that give us such an indication as that. In Deuteronomy 30 verse 15, we read a few, we'll look at a few. See, I have set before thee this day life and good and death and evil. There are so many passages which are almost a duplicate of this throughout the Old Testament. I have set before you life and death, good and evil. And there was encouragement upon the people to choose and make the proper choice. God didn't force it, nor does he force it now. He made his people of choice are people who could make a decision, even if it's in the wrong way. That's how God fixed man. That's how he made us. And we are thankful that he has supplied us with an ability to decide, the capability of knowing right from wrong and making a decision at the proper time, which can so often alter and determine our afterlife. And the tragic thing is that a moment's decision in many a life has been that which has affected their entire life. And though we may overcome some wrong decisions, yet there are some decisions that we make that will determine some things in our life, all of our life. I remember one time a young sister who had made a bad decision. And a lot of times it brings upon us at the time some shame and a bit of disgrace, and sometimes a lot. But the sister in this particular sense had not forgotten that wrong decision, and she felt like nobody else had, which is a mistake because she'd made it right as best I think she could. But she felt like everybody else was still holding it against her, and everybody else looked down on her because she'd made a wrong decision a long time ago. It wasn't the case, and I told her that as far as the congregation was concerned. But she said, how long must I, or will I live with it? And I said, well, I suppose to answer that question, you'll live with it the rest of your life. There are things that remind you of it, and you yourself have a difficulty in forgetting it, but you have to overcome that. You have to rise above it. You've rectified the mistake, and that's what God expects you to do, and everybody else expects you to do and wants you to do as your friends and as your fellow laborers in Christ. You've done that. And now the only thing you can do is just take things in hand and go God's way, and do your best. And I tried to encourage her to do that, and I think she has. Haven't kept up with it all along, but I think she's done just that. But we have to make decisions. Men, as I suggested, are not really, they don't really want to. They want to be just going down life's road without any attachments, without any responsibilities, without any concerns, and it just doesn't work that way. Because even the decisions that men make who are out in sin affect them. And if they're just their life completely engrossed in sin, it affects them. I want to suggest to you this morning that God always has been concerned with the sins of aliens, or with the sins of those that He has not had covenant relationship with. That God never has just looked at the sins of a nation or of a city and disregarded it because they were not His people. And they were not under contract or covenant with Him. Never has been that way. And when you look at Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which were destroyed, and you look at Jonah going to Nineveh, and you look at Romans 1, the latter part of that chapter, where Paul enumerates the sins of the Gentiles who were not in covenant relationship with Him, had not been under former dispensation. And look at Paul's statement discussing about the Jews and the law in Galatians, the 2nd chapter, who, winding up an argument, said, "We are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles." They were sinners. And they broke the moral law which God gave to them. In 1 Kings 18, verse 21, "And Elijah came unto all the people and said, How long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow Him. If Baal, then follow him. And the people answered him not a word." You remember that time. And there had come a time, as far as this prophet of God was concerned, that decisions had to be made. There was no time to go on and just halting between two opinions. There's nobody more miserable than somebody who's halting between two opinions, if it's right and wrong. They're miserable in that. And the quicker you make the proper decision in life, the happier you're going to be, and the more satisfied with yourself, and the greater influence you're going to have over people around you. And as I suggested, whether you like it or not, you have to make those decisions. Somebody says, "Well, you really feel that I have to?" And yes, you do. Jesus said in that great invitation, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." That's one of the reasons I said last night you can't attend a service like this where the gospel, the pure gospel, is preached and go away the same individual. If you're lost in sin, bear in mind that invitation is directed to you. If you've never obeyed the gospel, it's directed to you. If you've reached that age in life, the stage in life where you feel accountable to that to God, remember, you do something with that invitation. You either accept it and obey Him, or you refuse it. There's a conversation we sometimes use between a fellow who was, really maybe not so strong an atheist, but an agnostic mostly, and he began to talk about Jesus. I remember in California in school one time in class, a young lady asked the teacher, somehow we had got on religion, and the young lady asked the teacher, "What do you think about Jesus Christ?" That kind of put her on the spot. She said, "Well, I think he was a great teacher, a great philosopher. I think he he played a great part in history, and she never would acknowledge him as the Son of God. And that conversation we just mentioned a while ago between the two people, that man said, I think he was a good man. I think he was a good example when he lived, and we're glad it's written down on the pages of history, but I just don't believe he was the Son of God. And he said, wait a minute. This just won't work. He was either the Son of God, or he wasn't even a good man. He was a liar. And you can't have it your way. You can't have it both ways. And this morning, he is meaningful to us and means something to us because we have owned him and know him to be the Son of God. And only in that official capacity, like we talked about last night, is he meaningful to the world and to every single individual here today. And somewhere along the way, you must make the proper decisions in your life as to what he means to you. And what kind of place he's going to have in your life. What part his teachings will play in your life. We were thankful last night, it's been mentioned, but we mention it again because we like to see people who make decisions and who make a start to live a Christian life and to do right. To make that the best thing in their life, and it certainly is. But why decide? Well, let's look at a few things as to why it's important that you make a decision. First of all, time is uncertain. And we just don't know about what tomorrow may bring. James in the 4th chapter, verse 13 and 14 said, Go to now, ye that say, Today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and buy and sell and get gain. Whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even as a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. And any of us who have reached any age much in this old world at all will vouch for that, as we sometimes say. Life is very, very short. I was very amused about 15, 20 years ago by a brother. You almost have to know him to appreciate the levity in this, but he said, I lost 10 years of my life. And he said, I was on the job with my brother. He was a carpenter. And he said, I was on the job with my brother, and somebody asked me how old I was, and I said, well, I'm so-and-so, and my brother looked at me and said, you better think again. And he said, oh, I know how old I am. I've got it on my driver's license, my fishing license, and everything. Yeah, I know how old I am. And he said, I picked up a board, and I had a pencil as a carpenter. He said, I picked up a board and got the figure, and he said, there was 10 years of my life I still don't know where they went. Well, it was amusing to me. Rather amusing. As I've gotten to the age of 60, it's not too amusing. I look back, and though I know where those years were and how they went, you can almost feel for him losing 10 years of his life and really not knowing where they went. It can happen just about that quickly. Well, that's life. It's just like a little fleecy fleck of cloud that makes its appearance on the perfect blue dome of the morning, only to disappear with the rising sun. That's what James says. That's how quick it is. So it's important that we make decisions and not just be uncertain about it, because time is so uncertain. And there's many an individual who has really the intentions to do right and has put it off and continues to put it off and thinks someday I will, who never made the decision. Time ran out, and while they really had good intentions, it never worked. There was experience in my younger years of preaching of some fellows that I knew, and I still know the family well and the brothers well in that family. And a couple of them, one of them 30 years of age, and another one a little older who actually had preached for a while and seemed to be very strong in his in his belief. But somewhere along the line, he got sidetracked. He owned a little business. He even sold liquor. He knew better. His conscience bothered him all the time. He had gone to a brother, not very many nights before this happened, but he'd gone to a brother and talked to him at almost the midnight hour, he said. And then he said, you know, I think I'll go to Springfield and talk to Brother Robertson, which was my father he had reference to, who was living at that time. I think I'll go talk to him. He was bothered about it. But on Sunday morning, or near noontime, maybe a little after noon, he had gone fishing with his brother, or squirrel hunting, rather. And on the way back home, you have to know the road to know how dangerous it is, and you people can relate to this. You, like in Missouri, have some roads that are hilly and curvy, and that road was that way. But they crested a hill and met a cattle truck head on. The older fellow who had preached Stephen's song was killed immediately. The day I preached his funeral, his brother died. I don't know what might have happened had they lived. I just know they didn't live. And they got caught in sin. What a tragic thing. It left an impression on that community which they shall never forget, and especially, of course, the family and the church. And they wondered perhaps if they had done enough, and if they had impressed them enough about the need to make a decision. But they waited too long. So we say about making a decision, it's important. Time is a very uncertain thing. We must make a decision because God requires it. In Matthew 6, verse 24, no man can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Hey, he makes a very flat statement here. You can't serve God and mammon. You can't serve two masters. That's just like saying, he didn't quibble about it. He didn't say it's hard to serve God. He said you can't do that. That's like saying you can't go east and west at the same time. That's a fact. Well, somebody says, couldn't one divide his time between two masters, give some to one and some to the other? No, it won't work. And I think the word that is really important here is the word servant. To serve. And if we are a true servant of God, we don't divide our time and our service to some other master, to something which actually perhaps is projected here that might pull us apart from Him. You can't do that. Money, material things are important to us in life. We have to have it to live. But it's not the most important thing in our life. That belongs to God. But God requires that decision. I think also that one is unstable who will not decide. We have a lot of problems in the church today, and I don't need to tell you that. I'm sorry to have to be able to tell you that. But I don't think any of us ought to hide our heads in the sand and say, hey, everything's just lovely. We need rather men who will stand on the walls and cry aloud and spare not. We have problems. We need men to tell us about those problems and the dangers that are out there in the world and that we face in the church. The numbers in many of the congregation have been depleted. And division has ensued because the devil has had his way, actually. We have a lot of issues that we could bring to the surface here and mention to you. But mostly we have problems with getting people to do what they know is right and make the right decision. You know what? That's true. You know what our preaching mostly consists of? Telling you what you already know is right. You tell that child over and over again what's right, and when they do something wrong, you point it out, even though you've done it yesterday and the day before. You don't keep on nagging. I mean by that, you try to be diplomatic in that, but you're consistent in the fact that you tell them what's right. You want them to do right. And so our preaching consists a great deal of impressing you with what's right in your life. You already know that. But all of us need encouragement to do just do what's right. We have problems on the marriage question. And I'll grant you this, that in most congregations across our brotherhood, if we could get people, get brethren, to just take a stand on what they already know is right and what they believe already to be truth and is truth, truth would abound, and the numbers in our congregations would expand, and things could be turned. I really believe things could be turned around in many a place if we could just get the brethren to stand up and believe and do what they believe already and stand for the truth. So we emphasize that. In fact, as we look around and as we go from place to place and see some examples, we see some congregations who are turned around, maybe not by a number of people, but sometimes with just one individual who had courage to stand up, make a decision in his life and stand up and make a call for what's right. There was a young man that I remember, and I'm not so sure what became of all of this, but in that congregation was a case where everybody understood it was not right. Even those who believed that there was a cause, a justification for a divorce and a remarriage, there was not even the cause there for that limited number. And so there was no justification for fellowshipping such a thing as that. There would not be anyway, but there wouldn't have been with those people who had the wrong position even. And there was a young man who really didn't have any talent in leadership. He was not one who was a major part of the leadership of that congregation. He was just one who knew what the truth was. And finally, in a business meeting where they'd come together and discuss it quite a few times, he just stood up and said, "Brother, we've mauled this around. We've gone over this over and over again. I'm going to tell you something. It's either you make a decision as leaders in this congregation to clean this thing up, or don't you expect me to come here?" And they had some respect for this fellow. He was a young man at that, but they had some respect for him. And they began to look, hey, you know, this young fellow actually is telling us the truth. He's telling us the truth. And while they got rid of that particular situation because of the strength that this young man showed at that time, I'm not sure what happened, as I suggested in the days and weeks that followed. But you have to appreciate somebody who sees you just can't continue to halt between two opinions. You have to make a decision. And knowing what's the right decision, then make it. There's no use to halt. But a man is unstable who will not make a decision. He's unstable. You know, James says in James 1 and 8, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And I don't think you could find a better way to explain or define a fellow who just won't decide. I won't take a stand. He tells you one thing and somebody else something else, even though he knows what's right sometimes. Or if he won't study his Bible so he can find out what's right, because he don't want to make a decision. He knows that to do so will cut off some of his closest friends. So he just stays right in the middle. He tries to. We must make a decision to be wise. In Luke 16 verse 4, when the prodigal son, oh no, this is not that. I beg your pardon. We'll just quote it and let you see what it is. I'm resolved what to do then. When I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. Here was a fellow, this is a different parable, but here was a fellow who looked the situation over and seeing what was about to happen to him, finally saw the best road to take and resolved. This was what he was going to do. It takes some resolution, some resolving before you can take the right road. And I like to bring in just here Daniel himself, who being confronted with a situation where he was going to be received into the king's court, and an officer of the king's court the very first thing that happened and put him to a test was that he sat down at a table where there was on that table the king's meat and the king's wine. And now what are you going to do, Daniel? Don't you think it's all right to just say, well, look, everybody does this anyway. Everybody sits down at the king's table and eats what's put before them. And I'm away from my home country and nobody hardly knows me anyway. It won't leave any mark much at all. And after all the service is destroyed at Jerusalem in the home city and everything's in disarray, what's the use of me standing for anything? But I want to show you something important this morning. If you make up your mind to do right, regardless of what comes and what goes, before you get to the forks in the road, you've got it made. Before you get to the forks of the road, and one leads in the wrong direction and one leads to the right, before you get there, settle some things in your life. Settle this right here. You're going to do right regardless of what the cost is. You're going to do right regardless of make the right decision, regardless of what it costs you, what you have to sacrifice, what friends you lose, what money you lose, or anything else you lose. And that's exactly what the Lord requires of you. You have to deny self and take up your cross and follow Him. But I'm suggesting it's not so difficult to make those decisions if you already set your course and you decided. You may have to look at a given situation. I must suggest this. But just decide that having done so, you're going to do right, regardless of what the cost is. I understand what the devil has done at the forks of the road. He has eliminated that road of wrong decision. Makes it very appealing. Very appealing. And the road to the right, at that point at the forks, may not look too bright. May not look too bright. You have to lean on the promises right here that God makes, that if you do my will, you're going to be blessed. Seek first the kingdom, the cause in the kingdom, and the things that you need to sustain this physical body will be given you, be granted you. I've seen many an individual, especially in way back yonder in my younger years, in the war years, in the big war years, many an individual move away from a place where he could worship God. He and his family could worship God because over yonder was a plant which paid him 3 times what he could make. And so he moved away from a congregation, moved away from where he could worship his God, and where he could attend the services of a faithful congregation. And you know what he said? Well, I've got to make a living for my family, or else the Bible says I'm worse than an infidel. I don't know if I've mentioned this here, but a number of you know the situation, or know the area around Charleston, West Virginia. And in my younger years, I suppose I held more meetings in the area there than anywhere else. And as a young man came in contact with a problem which was a big problem in there because it was a chemical industrial area. As we mentioned last evening, they ran those plants 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so to speak. Valves had to be checked and turned and so on, and brethren made their living there. And they almost inherited a problem. What are you going to do on that Sunday wherein the plant says, you got to work? It's your time to work. It was a matter of making a decision. Had to be made. All of us as preachers talked about it and preached on it. I don't think any of us were negligent about that. But I remember one year, and I mentioned names which touched the lives of some of you people and the hearts, I'm sure, of some of you people. But I remember one year I went to that area for a meeting, and I thought to myself, instead of preaching it publicly this time, I'm going to talk it in the homes and to the individuals. All of us have done so publicly, and we've done so in the homes too. But I'm going to preach it to every individual. that I feel at this point, and some of it had been resolved in the lives of some people already, but at this point touched their lives. And so I did that. And we had a meeting before it was over, because there was a little stir in the congregation about it, and we discussed it and talked about it. Yes, I made a few enemies. One or two at least, who to this day don't feel quite right about me, because I'll being as strong as I was. However, above that, they made a proper decision about the service. And you know what I've said about that a lot of times? You know, if it took they're not quite feeling as strongly toward me, and they'd always been very close friends. If it took they're not feeling so strongly about me to make them to do right, so be it. So be it. I wouldn't have it any other way. But after I left, the thing continued to go on. And Brother Ivan McAllister made his confession for working on Sunday. One of the brethren in a little business meeting said, "Hey, what's going to happen?" And I've always told this and thrilled to tell it, because it was something to me. He said, "What's going to happen when Brother Ivan's called on the next time and it's his appointment to go to work?" Ivan always said, right over there. This has been that church house. Right over there. Most of the time. But I was called at 11 o'clock one night, and the sister told me this story. She said, "I thought you might like to hear it." She woke me up, but that's all right. I did want to hear it. And to me, it was good to hear. But in that little meeting, when that question was asked, "What's Ivan going to do when they call him to work?" And he stood up and said, "Hey, let me settle this for you right here." And on the way home, having made his confession on the way home, we talked about that, my wife and I. And he said, "It don't make any difference. Come Sunday morning, come time to worship my God, you're going to find me sitting right over there on the seat." That settled it. That settled it. In his life, and I suggest in the thoughts and minds of a great deal of others. I went back up in June of that following year. And Ivan said, "You know, we've always said to do right pays. And if you put the church first, it pays." And I said, "I believe that." He said, "I believe it." He said, "After having done that, I got a little change in my position in that plant. I don't have to work on Sunday morning anymore. This is June, about 6 months into the year, and I've made more this year than I ever made in any year in my life." I believe it pays to serve God. I believe it pays to make the right decision. I want to make it a little stronger. I know it does. You know it does. At the forks of the road, it may not seem that way. I don't mean to say that when you make the decision and start down the right road, your income's going to double. No, that's not the way it is. But the road is illuminated by something or by one who has all power in heaven and in earth, and who can make his promises come true and be realistic. And I'll guarantee you, you will never feel bad about making the right decision, about doing right, even if it looks really dim. No, you won't. No, you won't. You know, I as a young fellow going into that situation there, and some of those older fellows would say, "Hey, look, I've worked here for as long as, well, I don't know how many years, and I'm at this stage of my life, and what am I going to do for another job?" Nothing paid like, probably not much at least, paid like the chemical plants paid in that area. And you almost thought, man, that is quite a decision, isn't it? You know, that is quite a thing to have to face. But we never backed off of saying and teaching exactly what we felt was necessary. That tells you something how we feel about church attendance. That tells you something how we believe how important it is. That we meet around the Lord's table. That we commune with Him every first day of the week. It's not just a thing which happens now and then. I hope it also tells you something else. We don't believe in convenience worship. I mean, we don't believe that you can meet with your wife in your house that morning so you can go to work that morning and it'll be all right. Because you've broken a command to assemble yourselves with the saints. There is an assembly. There is, in your community, if there's a faithful congregation, there is a group of people who come together for the purpose of worshiping God. There is an organization here. There are officers in that organization, maybe not appointed, but at least recognized men. There is a group of people who have knitted themselves together for the purpose of increasing the Lord's work in the area and for the purpose of worshiping God. And this is the only place, as far as I'm concerned, in the faithful congregation that we can faithfully worship God. You cannot worship God because you went on a vacation and found yourself a long way from a congregation, out in the mountains or on the riverbank or on the lake bank. Hey, my friend, you have violated a command to assemble yourselves together. You have forsaken the assembling of yourselves together. Make a decision in your life. Somebody said, well, it happened in our area. And we were trying to impress a fellow who had moved in there from Texas. Hey, this is our belief on that. And I found out that they were going to go about 40 miles down the road and have service on the lake bank. And I said to myself, I better visit the doctor before he does that, because we're going to have some problems in this congregation of using him, of calling on him, if he does that. And so I went to see him. He got a little mad about it. He said, well, I can't even go on a vacation. He said, I'm denying my children so much of the privileges that they would otherwise have. I can't even go on a vacation. Oh, I said, Doctor, there's a lot of people in our congregations who take vacations. And doing so, worship God in a congregation that's scriptural and right because they plan it. Oh yeah, you can take a vacation. You might have to vary it a little bit. Maybe quite a little bit. But what does that mean in comparison to doing what's right? Well, he called me up a little while after that, or a day or two after that, and said, we've decided we'll be at church. And I said, well, I appreciate that. I felt he was teachable. It was not to be, but I felt he was teachable on that subject at that point. And it was only 40 miles away anyway, you know, which I pointed out to him, which seemed to me to be very unnecessary. But that problem started, and I'll just briefly touch on it and then close with one more point. But that problem started in our country a long, long time ago down on the lake in Warsaw, Missouri. I think it was kind of brought to our attention in Warsaw, Missouri, which is a lake town on a couple of lakes, actually. And brethren, at that time there was not such a rift between those of us in the church on the marriage question, but brethren from various parts just never thought anything about coming down to the park in Warsaw, where there was a congregation, and meeting out in the park. A couple of families. That's how indifferent they were as to whether they come to the church or not. That's what got us all to really looking at it in that country I'm talking about. Not that we had any other idea about it to begin with, but we said we've got a little problem here. We're going to have to start working on it, and we did. Now, my brother Luke lived in Warsaw at that time, and if you know Luke, you know Luke can be pretty firm and pretty straightforward in what he says, and he was about that, without a doubt. And We looked at this point, and I'll go on. Distance really doesn't make a difference. Really. If I can drive 1,000 miles away and worship God out on the creek bank, I can drive 10 miles away and do the same thing. Realistically. Realistically. So that tells you something about how we feel about God's teachings, Christ's teachings about a church assembly, the apostles' teachings. In assembling in the church. Decide for yourself, hey, don't go anywhere, don't move anywhere, don't put yourself in a position where you cannot fulfill the commandments of God. Just decide that before you ever start out. That may make a difference where you move. That may make a difference in some of the things that you allow in your life and do in your life, activities and so on. But decide that to begin with, and then it won't be so difficult. When you get to the forks of the road, you may have to stop a little while and be sure you're going to make the right decision. But just be sure of this, that you're going to do your best to know what's right, and then do it with all your might. I think the Bible teaches just that. Well, the Lord one time, having taught some things which were difficult for the apostles, or for the crowd to take, and they went away. They began to turn away from him. It was a time to test perhaps the apostles, his disciples, when he asked, will you also go away? Will you follow the crowd? What's your decision? I hope Peter settled it for all of them. But it didn't seem to take long for him to come across with an appropriate answer. Lord, to whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life. Where are we going to turn to if we leave you? Where are you going to go, folks, if you leave God? I don't even have to answer that question. You know. You know. And so we encourage you today to make the proper decisions in your life. If you're present having never obeyed the gospel, you can do that. You can come this morning believing, repenting, confessing Christ before men, being baptized into Him. That's the greatest decision. As we said last evening about the three who came forward, that's the greatest decision one can make in life. Or if you're present as a member of the church and you've done wrong, you made the wrong decisions, thank God for the second law of pardon. Thank God you can rectify your mistakes. You can straighten out the mistakes that you've made. Get back on the right track. And you can bring joy once again to your life. If either class be in our midst, we invite you to come while we stand, while we sing.